There is a morning coming. Not tomorrow, not next week, but somewhere in the stretch of time that belongs to the future. A morning that looks exactly like this one. The alarm goes off at the same hour. The light through the window is the same pale gold it always is. The coffee maker begins its familiar hiss and the smell drifts through the hallway like it always does. You reach for your phone. The screen lights up. Messages, whether the small digital noise of a world that is still running. You do not think about any of this. Why would you? It has always worked. It will always work. That is what mornings feel like. That is what safety feels like. The assumption that tomorrow will resemble today is not laziness. It is the foundation of every plan you have ever made. But underneath that morning, underneath the coffee and the warm light and the glowing screen, there is a system running that you have never once thought about. It runs without your permission. It asks for nothing. It produces no sound, no heat, no visible sign of its own existence. It has been running since before the first fish swam in the first ocean. It will run long after the last city has gone quiet. And on the morning we are imagining tonight, that system stops. Not with a bang, not with any warning at all. No alarm goes off for this. No screen lights up to tell you. The coffee still smells the same. The light through the window is still that same pale gold. You pick up your phone and the messages are still there, and the weather app still loads and the world still sounds like it is running. And for a few hours, maybe even a full day, nothing feels different. That is the most important thing to understand about what we are exploring tonight. The end of something ancient and essential does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just stops quietly while you are drinking your coffee, and the world continues for a little while on the memory of what it used to be. We are going to follow that morning forward. We are going to watch, slowly and carefully, what happens to the world you know when the invisible thing that holds it together lets go. This is not a story about asteroids or volcanoes or any of the dramatic catastrophes that populate our nightmares. This is quieter than that. And because it is quieter, it is in some ways harder to hold in your mind. The threats we fear most are the ones we can picture: a wall of fire, a rising sea, a crack in the ground. But the threat we are following tonight has no shape. You cannot point at it. You cannot photograph it or run from it or fight it with anything you own. You can only watch as the things you rely on begin, one by one, to come undone. The Earth's magnetic field. You have heard the words. You may have learned something about it once, in a classroom, on a screen, in a voice drifting through headphones on a night that felt a lot like this one. But knowing the words and feeling what they mean are two different things. Tonight we are not going to study the field from a distance. We are going to stand inside the world it protects and watch that protection disappear. We are going to feel the weight of something we have never once been asked to carry, because it has always been carried for us. Think about the morning again. The phone in your hand. That small rectangle of glass and metal is the product of a civilization that grew up inside a specific set of conditions. Not just the right temperature. Not just the right amount of oxygen. Those things matter enormously and we know it. But there is another condition, one that never makes it onto the list, one that never gets mentioned when we talk about what makes Earth a place where life can exist and build and grow. The magnetic field is the condition we forgot to include. It is the oldest piece of infrastructure on this planet. It predates every living thing. It predates the oceans themselves. And it has been so reliable, so perfectly constant for so long, that we built an entire technological civilization on top of it without ever once acknowledging that it was there. When engineers design a satellite, they account for heat. They account for radiation to a degree. They account for the vacuum of space and the stress of launch. What they do not account for is the possibility that the invisible shield holding that radiation at bay simply ceases to exist. Why would they? It has never happened in the lifetime of any instrument we have ever built. The field has been there through every experiment, every launch, every data transmission in the history of human technology. Its reliability is so total that it became invisible. And invisible systems are the ones we never prepare to lose. So on this imagined morning, the coffee is still hot, the phone still works, the satellites are still up there spinning their quiet orbits, the power lines are still humming, the internet is still breathing, the whales are still following their ancient roots through the deep ocean, the birds are still reading the sky. Everything is still running on the memory of the field. The world has not yet noticed what it has lost. And you, sitting there in your kitchen with the pale gold light on your face, are the last version of yourself who does not know what is coming. Drink your coffee. Let the warmth of it settle in your chest. Because we are about to follow this morning forward, and the world we arrive at looks nothing like the one you are sitting in right now. What you are about to hear is not a prediction. It is not a warning designed to frighten you out of sleep. It is something older than that. It is the kind of story that civilizations used to tell each other in the dark, not to cause panic, but to understand. To look directly at the thing we depend on and feel for just a moment how extraordinary it is that it is there at all. To take the invisible and make it visible. To take the granted and make it a gift. By the end of this journey, the morning we started in will feel different to you. The coffee will taste the same. The light will look the same. But you will know something you did not know before, and that knowledge is not a burden. It is a kind of quiet wonder, the feeling of understanding where you are and what is holding you here and being grateful, deeply and completely grateful that it still is. Let your body settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting right now. We are going to take our time with this. There is no rush. The field is still there. The morning is still yours. And the story we are about to tell begins not with the end of everything, but with something much smaller and much more important. It begins with the question of what the field actually is, and why the word invisible does not mean the same thing as the word unimportant. In fact, in the entire history of this planet, there may be no better proof that those two words have nothing to do with each other. Something invisible has been standing between you and the sun your entire life. You have never seen it. You have never felt it directly. And yet without it, the sun that warms your face every morning would be doing something very different to you. Understanding what the field is, really is, not as a textbook definition, but as a living thing, is the first step in understanding what it means to lose it. So that is where we are going next. Not into the disaster. Not yet. First, we are going to go down, deep down. Past the rock under your feet, past the layer of the planet where everything is solid and familiar, down into a place that has no name in any human language that feels adequate, a place where the rules of the surface do not apply, and where the thing that keeps you alive is being made, right now, in the dark. Every structure you have ever stood inside was built by someone. The walls were raised by hands. The roof was placed by hands. The floor beneath your feet was laid down by a decision, a plan, a person who showed up one morning and began. We understand buildings this way. We understand cities this way. We walk through the world and we see the evidence of builders everywhere we look, in the angles of doorways, in the curves of bridges, in the careful geometry of windows catching light. We are very good at recognizing the work of architects. What we are not good at is recognizing the work of architects we cannot see. The Earth has one of those. It has had one for nearly 4 billion years. It did not use hands. It did not use plans in any sense we would recognize. It used heat and pressure and motion and the deep, patient logic of physics. And what it built is not a building or a bridge or a city. What it built is the condition that made all buildings and bridges and cities possible. It built the invisible structure that stands between life and the thing that would end it. And it built it so far beneath us, in a place so removed from any surface we will ever touch, that we have spent the entire history of our species walking on top of its work without knowing the work was there. To find the architect, you have to go down, not a little down, not the kind of down that means a basement or a mine or even the deepest cave system humans have explored. You have to go down through all of that and keep going, through the solid rock of the crust that we call home, through the slow churning rock of the mantle that moves like something between solid and liquid over millions of years, down and down through heat and pressure that have no equivalent on the surface, until you arrive at a depth of nearly 3,000 kilometers below the ground you are lying on right now. And there, at that depth, the planet changes completely. The rock stops being rock. The rules stop being the rules you know. What you find there is not solid. It is not the kind of thing you could stand on or point at or describe with the vocabulary of the surface world. What you find is a sea, an ocean of liquid metal, mostly iron, running at temperatures close to the surface of the sun, under pressures that would compress any object from the surface into something unrecognizable. It is thousands of kilometers thick. It is in constant, violent motion. And it has been in that motion, without pause, without rest, for longer than the oldest fossil we have ever found. This is not a metaphor. The outer core of the Earth is a real ocean of real liquid metal, moving in real currents that follow real physical laws. And those laws, specifically the laws that govern what happens when a conducting fluid moves through a magnetic field, are what turn this underground sea into the most important machine on the planet. When the liquid iron moves, it carries electric charge with it. Moving electric charge creates a magnetic field. That magnetic field influences the motion of the iron, which creates more charge, which creates more field. The loop sustains itself. It has been sustaining itself for nearly 4 billion years. And the field it produces does not stay underground. It rises up through the mantle, through the crust, through the soil and the bedrock and every city and forest and ocean on the surface, and then it keeps going out into space, stretching thousands of kilometers beyond the atmosphere, forming a shape that scientists call the magnetosphere. The magnetosphere is the true boundary of the Earth, not the shoreline, not the edge of the atmosphere, the magnetosphere. It is where the planet ends and where the protection begins. From the outside, if you could see it, it would not look like a perfect sphere. The sun is always pushing against one side of it, compressing it, flattening it, forcing it closer to the surface on the day side. On the night side, away from the sun, the field stretches out in a long tail, pulled like the wake of something moving through water. It is asymmetrical and dynamic and constantly responding to the pressure of the solar wind, shifting and flexing and holding. Always holding. What it is holding back is the solar wind itself. And this is where the word architect starts to feel exactly right. Because the field did not just appear. It did not drift into place by accident. It is the product of a specific kind of motion deep inside the planet, a specific arrangement of forces that happen to produce exactly the right shape of protection for a world trying to hold on to its atmosphere and its water and its life. Change the rotation of the planet and the field changes. Change the composition of the core and the field changes. Change the heat flowing outward from the center and the field changes. Everything about this machine is tuned, not by intention, not by any intelligence we could point to, but by the slow and patient work of physics finding its own balance over billions of years. The architect did not have a plan. It just kept building until the building held. And what it built is this: a barrier that deflects the most dangerous energy the sun produces before that energy can reach the surface. The solar wind is not a gentle thing. It is a continuous stream of charged particles moving at hundreds of kilometers per second, carrying radiation that would, over time, do to Earth what it did to Mars. Mars lost its magnetic field billions of years ago. Mars lost its atmosphere. Mars lost its water. Mars is now a cold, dry, nearly airless world where the surface temperature averages 60 degrees below zero, and any liquid water exposed to the open air would simultaneously freeze and evaporate. Mars is the answer to the question of what happens without the field. Mars is the future we are not living in, because 4 billion years ago, the liquid iron in our outer core began to move in the right way and has not stopped since. The field is also the reason the sky is blue. Not directly, not through some simple chemical relationship, but through the chain of consequences that flows from having an atmosphere thick enough and intact enough to scatter light in the way a blue sky requires. The atmosphere exists in its current form because the field has been protecting it for billions of years. Every breath you take is a product of that protection. Every cloud, every raindrop, every ocean, every river is downstream of the decision that liquid metal deep inside the planet made, without anyone asking it to keep moving in a circle. There is something worth sitting within that. The thing that makes your life possible is not on the surface. It is not in the sky or the soil or the water, though all of those matter enormously. The thing that makes your life possible is a churning storm of liquid iron in the deepest dark of the planet, 3,000 kilometers below your body right now, moving in patterns that have never been seen by any human eye, producing a field that reaches from the core to the edge of space, and doing all of this without ever asking for anything in return. The architect that built the condition for all life on Earth is invisible, underground, and completely indifferent to whether we notice it or not. It just keeps building, it just keeps holding. This is the system that on our imagined morning has stopped, not the outer core itself. The core is still there, still hot, still full of liquid iron, but something in the motion has shifted. The currents that produce the organized, coherent, protective field have lost their pattern. The feedback loop that sustains the field has broken down. The iron is still moving, but it is moving in a way that no longer adds up to a shield. It is moving in a way that adds up to noise. And noise in the language of magnetic fields means absence. The field is not gone in the sense of having been destroyed. It is gone in the sense of having become incoherent, scattered, too weak and too confused to do the work it has always done. The architect is still in the building, but the building is no longer standing. On the surface, the coffee is still hot. The light is still pale gold. Your phone is still in your hand and the screen is still lit and the world is still making all of its familiar sounds. But the boundary between you and the sun has just dissolved. The thing that has been standing between this planet and the full, unfiltered energy of a star has just stepped aside. And the sun, which does not know and does not care about the difference, is about to do what it has always done. It is about to keep going. And now, for the first time in the history of the human species, there is nothing in the way. This is the moment we need to understand before anything else. Because everything that follows, every consequence we are going to trace tonight, every light that goes out and every system that fails and every quiet change that moves through the biology of every living thing on the surface, All of it flows from this single moment. The architect stopped working. The building is down. The sun has a clear path to everything we have ever built, everything we have ever been, everything we have ever loved. And it does not start with fire. It does not start with any of the dramatic imagery we reach for when we try to imagine the end of something. It starts with something much stranger and much harder to describe. It starts with the sky doing something no human being alive today has ever seen. And what the sky does next is beautiful, and it is the most frightening thing on earth. The most dangerous things in the world do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with sound or heat, or the kind of visible change that triggers the part of your brain designed to note as threat. The most dangerous things arrive in the form of an absence, a silence where there used to be a sound, a stillness where there used to be movement, an empty space where something that mattered used to be. We are very good at noticing what has been added to our world. We are not good at noticing what has been taken away, especially when what has been taken away was invisible to begin with. On the morning the field stops, you will not feel it leave. There is no shiver that runs through the ground. There is no change in the quality of the light or the temperature of the air or the way sound travels through the room you are in. Your body, which is extraordinarily sensitive to certain kinds of change, was never given the equipment to sense this particular one. You cannot feel a magnetic field the way you feel heat or pressure or the texture of a surface under your fingers. The field is not that kind of thing. It does not interact with the surface of you. It passes through you, always has, and the passing leaves no mark you can consciously detect. So when it stops, the passing simply stops, and you feel nothing. This is the detail that stays with you when you really think about it. Not the consequences, which are enormous, but the moment itself. The absolute ordinariness of it. The field that has existed for nearly 4 billion years, that has shaped the conditions for every living thing that has ever existed on this planet, that has been the silent reason for every breath of every creature in the history of complex life, stops. And the immediate experience of that stopping, for every human being on the surface of the earth, is nothing at all. You pick up your coffee, you look at your phone, you hear the birds outside and the traffic in the distance and the particular silence of a house in the early morning. And the most important system on the planet is no longer running, and you do not know. For a few hours, almost nothing changes. This is important to understand. The field does not protect you the way a wall protects you, where removing the wall immediately exposes you to whatever was outside. It is more like the way a very large, very slow process protects you. The solar wind is always pushing. The field has always been pushing back. When the field stops, the solar wind does not instantly arrive at your door. The atmosphere is still there. It still has mass. It still scatters light and holds pressure and does all of the things it does on any ordinary morning. The atmosphere is not the field. It is a separate layer of protection, one that will last for a long time even after the field is gone. In the very short term, you are still inside something that shields you. But the field and the atmosphere are not independent systems. They are connected in ways that take time to reveal themselves, but that, once revealed, cannot be undone. The field has been protecting the atmosphere for billions of years, holding it in place against the constant pressure of the solar wind. Without the field, the solar wind begins to interact with the upper atmosphere directly. Not with the surface, not yet, but with the high, thin layers of gas at the very edge of space, the layers that do a specific and irreplaceable job for everything living below. Before any of that becomes visible from the ground, something else happens first. Something that is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary things a human eye could ever witness. The auroras break free. Under normal conditions, the aurora is a polar phenomenon. It exists because the field has a shape, and that shape funnels the charged particles from the solar wind toward the magnetic poles. The particles follow the field lines down toward the Arctic and the Antarctic, and when they hit the upper atmosphere at those specific locations, they excite the gas molecules there, and those molecules release light. Green, violet, sometimes red, rippling curtains of color in the polar sky. If you have ever seen an aurora, you know that it is one of those experiences that makes the word beautiful feel inadequate. It is not just beautiful, it is evidence of a process. It is the field made visible at its weakest points, at the places where it dips toward the surface and lets a little of the solar wind through. When the field collapses, the funneling stops. The charged particles from the solar wind are no longer guided toward the poles. They spread across the entire planet. And the aurora, which was always just the light produced by those particles hitting the atmosphere, spreads with them. Within hours of the field stopping, the first reports would start coming in from places that have never seen an aurora in recorded history. The tropics, the equator, the dense, humid air over rainforests, the warm nights over deserts, the sky above every major city on Earth, all of it all at once beginning to light up with color. Imagine standing in a city you have lived in your whole life, a city that has its own light, its own glow, its own relationship with the night sky, and looking up and seeing the sky doing something you have never seen it do. Curtains of green and violet moving across the darkness above the buildings, above the streetlights, above everything you have built. It would be one of the most widely witnessed events in human history. Every person on the night side of the earth would see it at the same time. Every phone would be pointed upward. Every social media platform would fill within minutes with the same image from 1,000 different cities. The sky is doing something impossible. The sky is lit up like the poles, everywhere all at once. And the reaction at first would be wonder, pure, uncomplicated wonder. The kind of feeling that makes you go very quiet and just look. Because it is genuinely one of the most beautiful things the atmosphere can do, and most of the people watching it would have no framework for what it means. They would not know that the beauty is a signal. They would not know that the curtains of light in the sky are the first visible evidence of a protection system failing. They would not know that what they are seeing is not a gift, but a warning, not a natural wonder, but a symptom, not the sky performing, but the sky coming apart. The scientists would know. The people whose instruments monitor the field around the clock, in observatories and research stations and satellite feeds, they would already be seeing data that does not make sense, readings that should be impossible, a field strength dropping toward values that have not been recorded in the entire history of instrumental measurement. And they would be making calls and sending messages and trying to reach the people who need to know. But the people on the streets, standing with their faces turned upward, watching the colors move across the sky, would not yet have received those messages. They would still be in the wonder. There is something to sit within this image. The entire human population of the night side of the earth, standing outside or leaning out of windows or gathering on rooftops, watching something beautiful, not knowing. It is one of the most human moments in this entire story. The capacity to witness something extraordinary and feel joy before you feel fear. The instinct toward wonder that has driven every great discovery, every great work of art, every great act of understanding in the history of the species. Standing under an impossible sky and feeling, before anything else, the simple animal pleasure of seeing something you have never seen before. Keep that feeling. Hold it for a moment. Because we are going to move forward now, and the wonder does not last long. The beauty in the sky is real. but it is not benign. By the time the day side of the Earth turns toward the night and sees what is happening, the upper atmosphere will already be changing. The chemistry that makes the sky safe will already be under pressure, and the cascade that begins with a beautiful light show in the sky will be moving, quietly and invisibly, towards something that has no beauty in it at all. The aurora was always the field made visible. Now the whole sky is the field made visible. And what the sky is showing you, if you know how to read it, is that the invisible architect has left the building. The structure it spent 4 billion years constructing is no longer standing, and everything that was sheltered inside that structure is now exposed to the full attention of the star at the center of our solar system. The sun does not change. It does not become more violent or more powerful or more dangerous. It is exactly what it has always been. What changes is that the distance between you and it, the real distance, the distance that matters, the distance measured not in kilometers but in layers of protection, has just collapsed to almost nothing. The colors in the sky are gorgeous. They are also the last thing you will ever see that looks exactly the way it always has. From here, the world begins to change. And it changes in a direction that has only one name. The lights, the real lights, the ones that run on electricity and infrastructure and the assumption of a stable sky, are about to go out. The ozone layer is not something you can see. It is not something you can point to from the ground and say, there, that is the thing. That is what stands between my skin and the part of sunlight that would destroy it. It exists in the stratosphere, somewhere between 15 and 35 kilometers above the surface, a thin, diffuse region where ordinary oxygen molecules have been rearranged by ultraviolet light into a slightly different form. 3 oxygen atoms instead of 2. A small chemical difference that produces an enormous practical consequence. Ozone absorbs ultraviolet radiation. Not all of it, not perfectly, but enough. Enough that the surface below has been a place where DNA can exist without being constantly shredded. Enough that eyes can function, that skin can heal, that plants can grow toward the light without the light itself becoming the thing that kills them. Ozone is the reason the sun is a friend. Without it, the sun becomes something else entirely. The ozone layer has enemies. We know some of them because we made them. The chemicals that were once used in refrigerators and aerosol cans, the ones that were eventually banned because of what they did to the layer above Antarctica, those were human-made enemies, and we recognized them and we acted. But there are natural enemies too. Enemies that the ozone layer has been managing quietly for billions of years without any help from us. High-energy particles from the solar wind are among them. When those particles enter the upper atmosphere, they trigger chemical reactions that produce compounds which destroy ozone. Under normal conditions, the magnetic field keeps most of those particles away from the atmosphere entirely. The field is the first line of defense. The ozone is the second. When both are working, the surface is safe. When the field stops, the first line disappears. The solar wind, which the field has been deflecting for billions of years, begins to enter the atmosphere at latitudes it has never reached before. Not at the poles, where the field always allowed some particles through, and where the ozone layer has long dealt with the consequences. Everywhere. The entire atmosphere from pole to pole, from the tropics to the Arctic circles, begins to receive a sustained bombardment of high-energy particles that it was never designed to handle at that scale. And the ozone layer, which is extraordinary at what it does under ordinary conditions, is not built for this. The destruction does not happen all at once. This is not an explosion. It is a process, and processes take time, And the particular cruelty of this process is that it takes just long enough for the world to think, for a little while, that maybe it is going to be all right. The sky is still blue on the first day. The sun still rises in the east. The air still feels like air. But in the stratosphere, the chemistry is already changing. The compounds that break ozone apart are forming in quantities the upper atmosphere has never seen. And ozone, once destroyed, does not instantly replace itself. It reforms slowly, through a process that requires specific conditions and specific amounts of time. The destruction is fast. The recovery is slow. And what begins as a thinning, a weakening, an incremental reduction in the layer's ability to do its job, moves steadily in only one direction. Within days, the ultraviolet index at the surface begins to climb. Not dramatically at first, not in a way that triggers immediate physical pain or visible damage, but in a way that the instruments measure and the scientists watch and the numbers confirm is not within any range that has been recorded during the history of modern measurement. The UV index that most people are familiar with runs from 1, which is low, to 11 or above, which is extreme and represents a serious risk of skin damage within minutes of unprotected exposure. During the first week after the field stops, the readings in equatorial regions begin to push past those categories entirely, past extreme, into territory that the scale was not designed to describe, because no one who designed the scale thought it would ever be needed. The effect on the surface is subtle at first, and then it is not. Plants begin to show stress in ways that farmers and botanists recognize as UV damage. The tips of leaves bleach. Growth slows. The process of converting sunlight into energy, which plants have been performing for hundreds of millions of years, begins to be disrupted by the very light that drives it. Phytoplankton in the ocean surface, the microscopic organisms that produce a significant portion of the oxygen in every breath you take, are among the most sensitive living things to UV radiation. They begin to die in the sun-exposed surface waters. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough, and fast enough, that the base of the ocean food chain begins to feel the pressure within days. For animals on the surface, the change arrives as something confusing before it arrives as something painful. The quality of the light is different. Not visibly different, not in any way the eye can detect, because the eye cannot see ultraviolet. But the skin can feel consequences that the eye cannot see causes. The familiar sensation of spending time in the sun, the warmth, the gradual shift toward redness that signals overexposure begins to happen faster, then much faster. Within the first 2 weeks, spending unprotected time in direct sunlight during peak hours in equatorial and mid-latitude regions produces the kind of burn that would normally take hours in a fraction of that time. People who have spent their entire lives in sunny climates, who know their skin and its relationship to the sun, begin to notice that the relationship has changed. The sun is the same sun. The sky looks the same sky. But something is different, and the something is not visible, which makes it harder to explain and harder to believe and harder to protect against. There is a particular horror in a threat you cannot see. The magnetic field's absence is invisible. The UV radiation it was helping to block is invisible. The ozone destruction happening 30 kilometers above your head is invisible. Everything that is changing in a dimension that human senses were not built to detect. You can feel the heat of the sun on your face, and that feeling is familiar. And for most of your life, it has been benign. Now that same feeling is carrying something extra, something the warmth has always accompanied but has never before been allowed to deliver in these quantities. And because the sensation is familiar, because the sun has always been warm and you have always gone outside, and the sky has always been blue. The instinct to believe that things are fine is very strong. The instinct to believe that the familiar is the safe is very strong. It is one of the most useful instincts a species can have. And in this particular situation, it is also one of the most dangerous. The sky on these early days is extraordinary in ways that have nothing to do with the aurora. The light itself looks slightly different at certain angles, slightly harder, slightly more insistent, though this may be more a quality perceived by the already anxious mind than a true visual change. What is genuinely visible are the colors at sunrise and sunset, which become more intense, more saturated, more complex, as the changing chemistry of the upper atmosphere scatters light in new patterns. There are sunsets in the first weeks after the field stops that are among the most beautiful in the history of the planet. Reds and oranges and purples that have never been seen in quite that combination. Colors that result from the specific way a damaged atmosphere refracts the light of a setting sun. People photograph them. People stand outside and watch them. People feel, looking at those sunsets, something that is very close to peace. And this is the detail that stays with you, that the sky, in the process of losing what makes it safe, briefly becomes more beautiful. That the atmosphere, as it begins to change in ways that will matter enormously for every living thing beneath it, offers this last extraordinary display of color, as if showing you, one more time, what it is capable of before things go in a different direction. It is not a farewell. Nature does not do farewells, but it is something. A moment of pure visual splendor in the middle of a process that has no splendor in it. A reminder that beauty and safety are not the same thing, and that sometimes the most beautiful moment in a sequence of events is also the moment when the damage is most advanced. As those sunsets fade and the nights come, the aurora is still there, brighter now, more complex, spreading further across the sky as the field continues its collapse toward incoherence. And beneath it, the ozone layer is thinner than it was this morning, and tomorrow it will be thinner than it is tonight. And the day after that, the sun will rise on a world where going outside requires a calculation that the human species has never had to make before. Not a simple one, not just whether to wear sunscreen. A deeper calculation about exposure and duration and risk, about what time of day is safe and what time is not, about what can be done under open sky and what must wait for shadow or night or shelter. The sun has not changed. It has always been this powerful. What has changed is the layer of protection that stood between its power and the surface where we live. And that layer, which ozone has maintained for billions of years, is becoming too thin to do the job it was built for. The sky is still blue. The sun is still rising in the east. The air still feels like air, but the invisible fire is falling. And everything living beneath it is beginning slowly, without knowing quite what is happening or why, to feel the heat of something that was always there but was never, until now, allowed all the way through. There is a machine you have never seen. Most people have never seen it and will never see it and have no reason to think about it. It does not appear in the news unless something goes wrong with it. And even then the coverage moves quickly because the machine itself is not interesting to look at. It is large and gray and covered in cooling fins, and it sits inside a fenced compound somewhere you do not drive past on your way to work. It makes a low humming sound that nobody nearby ever really notices anymore. It is connected to wires that run in every direction. Wires that eventually reach your house, your office, your hospital, your water treatment plant. It is called a transformer. And without it, the electricity that moves through those wires would be the wrong size for the things it needs to power. Too high a voltage for homes and businesses. Too raw and unmanageable for the delicate systems that modern life depends on. The transformer steps the power down. It takes the electricity that travels efficiently across long distances at very high voltage and converts it, carefully, into something usable. It is the last gate between the raw power of the grid and everything the grid supports. There are hundreds of thousands of these machines distributed across the power infrastructure of the world. The largest of them, the ones that sit at the top of the system and handle the highest voltages, are not mass-produced items. They are custom-built, each one designed for a specific location, a specific load, a specific set of conditions, each one weighing hundreds of tons, each one taking between 1 and 2 years to manufacture and months more to transport and install. They are the most irreplaceable components in the entire system, and they are, by design, grounded, connected to the earth beneath them through a path of low resistance, because grounding is how you protect a transformer from the ordinary electrical disturbances that the grid produces every day. That grounding is also, in a specific and catastrophic circumstance, how you destroy one. When the magnetic field of the Earth changes rapidly, whether because of a solar storm pushing against it or because of a collapse like the one we are following tonight, the changing field induces electrical currents in anything long and conductive lying on the surface of the planet. Long power lines, long pipeline systems, long cable networks. The longer the conductor, the more current the changing field can push through it. And because power lines connect to transformers, and transformers are grounded, those induced currents have a path into the machines. They flow up through the grounding systems and into the magnetic cores of the transformers, and they do something that ordinary electricity, the kind the transformer was designed to handle, never does. They saturate the core. They push the magnetic material inside the machine past the point where it can manage the flux. And a transformer in saturation does not just stop working. It begins to consume itself. The core vibrates at frequencies it was never designed to handle. The heat builds in places where heat was never supposed to accumulate. The cooling oil inside the casing, which normally keeps the transformer at safe operating temperatures, begins to boil. The insulation breaks down. The windings, the carefully wound coils of copper that perform the transformation, begin to fail. And the machine that was built to last 30 years and was expected to last 50 dies in minutes. Not one machine, many machines, simultaneously across every region of the planet where the field is changing fastest, which in the scenario we are following tonight is every region, everywhere, all at once. This is the technical reality of what happens to the power grid when the magnetic field collapses. Not a dramatic explosion, not a visible event. A quiet, simultaneous destruction of the most irreplaceable components in the most critical infrastructure system humanity has ever built. The lights do not flicker. There is no warning. The power simply stops, and when it stops in a way that is not a blackout in any ordinary sense. It is not a blackout you wait out. It is not a blackout that repair crews can fix by replacing fuses and rerouting power. It is a blackout produced by the physical destruction of machines that take a year and a half to build, in a situation where hundreds or thousands of them have been destroyed at the same time, in a world that does not have a stockpile of replacements and has no way to manufacture them fast enough to matter. On the first day, the lights go out in regions. A city here, a province there. The pattern follows the geography of the power grid and the specific way the induced currents flow through different parts of it. Some areas lose power within hours of the field stopping. Others hold on for longer, protected by geography or grid design or the specific orientation of their transmission lines relative to the changing field. For a few days, the failure looks manageable from the outside. It looks like a very large but ultimately solvable infrastructure problem. Repair crews are deployed. Emergency protocols are activated. Backup generators come online at hospitals and data centers and water treatment facilities. The machinery of disaster response, which human civilization has become very good at over many decades, begins to move. But the machinery of disaster response runs on the assumption that the disaster has an end, that somewhere in the near future there is a point at which the damage stops accumulating and the recovery can begin. Every emergency plan ever written assumes this. Every backup generator was purchased and installed and fueled on this assumption. The generator at your local hospital was designed to run for 72 hours, perhaps a week if fuel is carefully managed, because in every scenario its designers imagined, help would arrive within that window. The grid would be restored. The fuel truck would get through. The power would come back. It does not come back. This is the detail that separates what we are describing from any blackout in human memory. The generators run out. The fuel in them burns through, and the fuel trucks that would normally resupply them are caught in the same spreading dysfunction. Because the logistics systems that track and route those trucks run on software that runs on power that is no longer available. The hospitals that were prepared for 72 hours of outage enter hour 96 and hour 120, and the refrigerators holding temperature-sensitive medications begin to warm. The ventilators that were running on backup power begin to slow. The water treatment plants whose pumps kept running on generator power begin to shut down, and the water that flows from taps in millions of homes is no longer being treated, and then it stops flowing at all, because the pumping stations that move it through the pipes have gone dark. The darkness spreads, not as a wave moving outward from a center, as a kind of settling, a slow inward collapse of all the systems that kept the light on and the water running and the food cold and the information flowing. Each system depends on other systems. Each system, when it fails, takes something from the systems around it. The supply chain that stocked the grocery stores runs on refrigeration that runs on power that is gone. The communications network that would coordinate the response to all of this runs on data centers that run on power that is gone. The financial system that would allow the purchase of emergency supplies runs on servers that run on power that is gone. The darkness is not just the absence of light. It is the absence of every system that was built on the assumption that the light would always come back on. Within 2 weeks of the field stopping, the power situation in most of the world has moved past the stage where it can be described as a crisis and into something that does not have a familiar name. It is not war. It is not famine, not yet. It is not any of the categories that emergency planning was designed around. It is the systematic failure of the infrastructure layer that all the other infrastructure layers sit on top of. It is the discovery that modern civilization is not a collection of independent systems that can each fail and be recovered independently. It is a single system, and the single system requires power, and the power requires the transformers, and the transformers require the field. But the darkness is not the only thing that is spreading. While the grid is failing on the surface, something else is happening above it. The satellites that the modern world depends on for navigation, communication, weather forecasting, financial transactions, and 100 other functions that most people never think about, are in orbit in a sky that is no longer the sky they were designed for. The atmosphere below them is expanding. The chemistry above them is changing. And the radiation environment that their electronics were built to tolerate is becoming something categorically different. The field that used to hold the most dangerous particles at a safe distance is no longer there. The Van Allen belts, the great donut-shaped rings of trapped radiation that encircle the planet and keep the most energetic particles away from low Earth orbit, are beginning to lose their structure. Without the field to contain them, the trapped particles are being released. They are spreading inward. They are reaching altitudes where satellites live. Electronics in space are hardened against radiation, but hardened within limits. Those limits were set based on the radiation environment that exists when the field is present and the Van Allen belts are functioning. When the belts dissolve and the trapped particles spread into the orbital lanes, the radiation levels climb past those limits. Satellites begin to malfunction. Their electronics, bombarded by particles they were never designed to tolerate, begin to produce errors. Some shut down into safe mode. Some lose attitude control and begin to tumble. Some simply stop responding. The GPS constellation, which has become so fundamental to modern logistics, navigation, and timing that it is embedded in systems most people do not even know depend on it, begins to degrade. Individual satellites fail. The network that requires a certain minimum number of functioning satellites to provide accurate positioning begins to drop below that threshold in some regions. The world that is already dark is also becoming lost, and it is becoming lost in both directions at once, vertically and horizontally, from the sky above and from the infrastructure below. The two systems that modern civilization uses to know where it is and to move things from where they are to where they need to be are both failing at the same time. And the people who are trying to manage the consequences of all of this are doing so in buildings that are running out of power, on communication systems that are becoming unreliable, with supply chains that are already breaking down, in a situation that no emergency plan in the history of any government anywhere in the world was written to address. On the street outside the building where decisions are being made, the city is quieter than it has ever been. Not peaceful quiet, not the quiet of a late night or an early morning or a holiday when most people are somewhere else. A different kind of quiet, the kind produced by the absence of things that were always running and are now not running. The hum of the grid is gone. The background noise of a civilization running on electricity is gone. And in that quiet, if you listen, you can hear something you have never been able to hear before from inside a city. The wind, just the wind, moving through streets that were built for a world that no longer quite exists, carrying the smell of the night, carrying nothing that tells you when the lights are coming back on. They are not coming back on. Not tomorrow, not next week, not for a very long time. And the city, like every city, is going to have to find a way to exist in the dark. But the dark is not the only problem. Outside the cities, beyond the grid and the satellites and the failing infrastructure of modern life, there is a world of living things that is dealing with a different kind of loss. A loss that has nothing to do with electricity. A loss that runs much deeper than any power line, into the biology of creatures who have been navigating by the field for longer than our species has existed. And their disorientation, which is already beginning, is going to play out across the oceans and the skies and the migration routes of the planet in ways that are as quiet and as devastating as the darkness settling over the cities. There is a whale somewhere in the Pacific Ocean right now. You do not know it and it does not know you, and there is no reason these two facts should ever intersect. But tonight, while you are lying still and the world outside is doing whatever it does at this hour. That whale is moving. It has been moving for days, following a route that it did not choose and did not learn and did not inherit in any way that involves memory or instruction. The route is older than memory. It is older than the species that travels it. It is written into the animal at a level below thought, below instinct, even at the level of physics, at the level of a protein in the retina that responds to something the eye cannot see and translates it into a direction, a pull, a certainty about which way is the right way to go. The whale is following the field. It has always followed the field. Every whale alive today is alive in part because its ancestors followed the field correctly, arrived at the right feeding grounds at the right time, found the right waters for raising their young, completed the journeys that needed to be completed. The field is not a tool the whale uses. The field is the map the whale is made of. When the field stops, the map disappears. Not gradually, not in a way that gives the animal time to find a different way of navigating. The quantum process that reads the field depends on the field being there, oriented in a specific direction, carrying the specific information that tells the animal where it is in relation to where it needs to be. When that information is gone, the process that reads it does not switch to a backup system. There is no backup system. There is just the absence of the thing that was always there, and the animal moving through water that suddenly has no meaning in it, no direction, no map, no pull toward anywhere in particular. Think about what it means to be an animal that navigates by a sense you were never aware of having. You did not decide to use the field. You did not develop a skill or learn a technique. The field was simply always there, and your body was always responding to it, and the response felt like knowing where to go. It felt, if it felt like anything at all, like certainty. The quiet, unquestionable certainty of a creature that is exactly where it is supposed to be, moving in exactly the direction it is supposed to move. And then that certainty is gone, not replaced by confusion, not replaced by a different kind of information. Just gone. The whale is still in the water. The water is still the ocean. The direction the animal is pointed is still a direction. But the thing that made that direction meaningful, the invisible coordinate system that gave every point in the ocean a location, and every location a relationship to every other location, has dissolved. What happens next is not dramatic in the way that human disasters tend to be dramatic. There is no sound. There is no visible distress. A whale that has lost its magnetic sense does not thrash. It does not signal its confusion to the world around it. It continues to swim because swimming is what it does. But the swimming is no longer organized around anything. The routes that have been followed for thousands of years begin to drift. Animals that should be moving north begin to move in other directions, or to circle, or to slow, not from illness but from the absence of the signal that told them to keep going, that told them that somewhere ahead, at the end of this direction, there is what they need. The consequences of this navigational collapse ripple through the ocean in ways that are connected to each other in ways that are not obvious until you follow the chain. The great whale migrations are not just impressive feats of animal endurance. They are ecological mechanisms. Whales move nutrients through the ocean. They feed in deep, cold waters, and they surface and they defecate in warm, shallow waters. And what they release into the sunlit surface layers is iron and nitrogen and phosphorus that the surface ecosystems of the ocean depend on. The whale migration is a pump. It moves the chemistry of the deep ocean into the place where phytoplankton can use it, where the base of the marine food chain can be sustained. When the migration stops, when the whales drift without direction and the ancient routes go untraveled, the pump stops, and the surface of the ocean, which is already under pressure from the increasing UV radiation coming through the thinning ozone layer, loses one of the chemical inputs it has always been able to count on. The birds are losing their maps too. Not just the seabirds that navigate over open ocean using the field as their primary reference, though those are disoriented within hours of the collapse. The land birds, the species that migrate over continents following routes that have been refined over millions of years, are also reading a signal that is no longer coherent. The magnetic sense in birds operates through the cryptochrome proteins in their retinas, proteins that respond to blue light and to the angle and intensity of the magnetic field in a way that is believed to produce something like a visual overlay, a faint indication of direction that sits in the bird's field of view like a compass that is always on. When the field collapses, that overlay does not just point the wrong way. It becomes noise. It becomes a visual interference, a constant flickering uncertainty in the sensory field of an animal that has never had to navigate without it. The spring migration, which would normally move billions of birds across the continents in organized flows following ancient corridors of wind and food and magnetic guidance, falls apart. Birds that should be heading north begin to fan out in random directions. Some continue to use the sun as a reference and make reasonable progress. Some use the stars at night and hold a general direction. But the magnetic sense was the integrating system, the thing that tied all the other navigation cues together and resolved the ambiguities they produced. Without it, the navigation is not impossible, but it is imprecise in ways that, at the scale of a migration involving billions of animals across thousands of kilometers, translate into chaos. Birds arrive at the wrong latitudes. They miss the narrow windows of food availability that their migrations were timed to match. They exhaust themselves searching for what should have been there and is not, because they arrived 2 weeks late, or 200 kilometers east, or in a place that simply has nothing to offer them. The insects are in the same situation. Bees navigate using the magnetic field, not as their only reference, but as one of several that work together to build the map they use to find flowers and return to the hive. When the field becomes incoherent, the bees do not stop flying, but their foraging range, which depends on the ability to navigate accurately over distances that seem large relative to the size of an insect, becomes erratic. They get lost. Not all of them, not all at once, but enough, and consistently enough, that the pollination services that agriculture depends on begin to show gaps. Crops that needed pollinators at a specific time begin to go unpollinated. The food system, which is already under pressure from the power grid failures and the supply chain disruptions, begins to receive a second signal from the biological layer below it. The insects that ran the pollination system are struggling to find their way home. Salmon are returning to rivers they can no longer find. The magnetic imprint of their natal streams, the chemical and geomagnetic signature that they have been carrying since they were young fish, and that was supposed to guide them back across the ocean to the specific stretch of river where they were born, no longer matches anything in the field they are swimming through. The field has changed too much, too fast, for the imprint to be useful. The salmon circle in coastal waters, trying to match a memory to a landscape that no longer corresponds. Some find their rivers by smell alone, the oldest and most local navigation system they have, and push upstream successfully. But many do not. The spawning that sustains the salmon population and the ecosystem of the rivers that depends on the salmon returning with the nutrients they carry from the ocean begins to falter. What is happening across all of these species at once is not a series of separate events. It is a single event, the loss of the field, expressing itself through every biological system that evolved alongside that field and came to depend on it. The ocean is not losing its whales to predation or pollution or temperature change. The sky is not losing its birds to habitat loss. The rivers are not losing their salmon to overfishing. They are all losing the same thing, the invisible coordinate system that made the planet navigable for everything alive on it. And they are losing it at the same time, simultaneously, without warning, in the middle of migrations and spawning runs and pollination cycles and feeding patterns that were all precisely timed to a world that had a reliable magnetic field. The ocean has no map now. The sky has no map. The rivers have no map. And the living systems that depended on those maps to function, to move nutrients and energy and genetic material around the planet in the organized patterns that make ecosystems work, are beginning to drift. The drift is quiet. It looks from the surface like nothing in particular. The ocean is still the ocean. The birds are still flying. The salmon are still swimming, but the organization is gone. The direction is gone. And without direction, movement is just movement, going nowhere in particular, achieving nothing in particular, sustaining nothing in particular. There is a loneliness in this that is hard to articulate. The whale in the Pacific, still moving, still alive, still perfectly capable of swimming, but cut off from the ancient knowledge that told it where swimming should take it. The bird crossing a continent it no longer knows how to read. The salmon circling at the mouth of a river it cannot quite find. Each one carrying in its body a system that evolution spent millions of years perfecting, a system that worked flawlessly through every change the planet threw at it, through ice ages and warm periods and shifting continents and changing sea levels. A system that had survived everything, until the thing it was built to read disappeared. We built our own navigation systems on top of the field too. The GPS constellation, which is failing in orbit above all of this, was our version of the cryptochrome compass. We externalized what the animals internalized. We built machines to do what evolution did in tissue. And when the field went, we lost our maps just as thoroughly as the whale lost its. We are circling in the dark in our own way, not swimming, not flying, but searching through broken infrastructure for a signal that is no longer there, for the direction that the field used to give us without being asked. The cities are dark. The satellites are failing. The ocean is drifting. And the UV radiation from a sun that now has a clearer path to the surface than it has had in billions of years is falling on all of it. On the dark cities and the drifting whales and the lost birds and the circling salmon, falling without preference or purpose, falling because that is what sunlight does when there is nothing in the way. The world is still here. It is still turning. The sun is still rising in the east. But the conditions that made it a world where things could navigate and build and grow have changed, fundamentally and without a clear way back. And the people in the dark cities are going to have to decide, each of them individually and all of them together, how to exist in a world that the infrastructure they built is no longer adequate for. They are going to have to go somewhere, or build something new, or both. They are going to have to figure out how to live when the sky is dangerous, and the nights are full of colors and the grid is down and the maps are gone. And some of them, the ones who think quickly and work together and find the right solutions, are going to survive this. Not unchanged, not without loss, but alive and building and beginning the long, slow work of adapting to a world that has shifted beneath them in a way that none of their plans accounted for. That story, the story of what humanity does when the sun becomes a threat and the cities go dark, is where we are going next. And it begins not with a plan, not with a government response, not with any of the organized systems we have built for managing disasters. It begins with a much older and much more reliable human instinct. It begins with going underground. There is a kind of danger that civilization is not good at responding to. We are excellent at responding to fast dangers. A fire, a flood, an explosion, a storm. These things arrive with urgency, and the urgency activates the systems we have built for exactly that kind of response. Alarms go off, people move, resources are deployed. The machinery of emergency spins up because the emergency is visible and immediate and has a clear beginning that everyone can agree on. We are very good at this. We have practiced it for centuries. We have built institutions and protocols and communication systems and supply chains all oriented toward the fast danger, the thing that arrives suddenly and demands an immediate answer. The slow danger is different. The slow danger does not activate the same systems because it does not arrive with urgency. It arrives with ambiguity. It arrives looking like something that might be fine, that might resolve itself, that might not be as serious as the first measurements suggest. It arrives in the form of a trend, a gradual shift in a number on a chart, a change that is real but not yet dramatic enough to feel like an emergency. And the slow danger is patient in a way that the fast danger is not. It does not need your attention to keep doing what it is doing. It keeps doing what it is doing whether you are paying attention or not. The ultraviolet radiation pouring through the weakening ozone layer is a slow danger. Not slow in the sense of being distant or abstract. Slow in the sense that its most serious consequences take time to accumulate in a body, time to become visible, time to cross the threshold from discomfort into damage, into something that cannot be undone. The sun is not going to burn you to nothing in a single afternoon, not in the first weeks, not even in the first months. What it is going to do is something more insidious, more patient, more difficult to point to and name as the cause of what you are experiencing. The first thing most people notice is the speed of sunburn. Sunburn is not new. Everyone who has spent time in sunlight has experienced it at some level. It is familiar enough that the familiarity itself becomes a kind of reassurance. You know what sunburn is. You know how it feels and how long it lasts and what to do about it. But the sunburn you get in the weeks after the field stops is not the sunburn you know. It arrives faster, much faster, in a fraction of the time that the same exposure would have produced a reaction before. People who have spent decades in sunny climates, who know their skin and its tolerance intimately, begin to burn in minutes of direct midday exposure where they would previously have tolerated hours. The scale has shifted. The familiar experience is the same experience but compressed, accelerated, intensified, and the familiarity is no longer reassuring because the thing that felt familiar is now operating by different rules. This acceleration continues. The UV index at the surface, which was already climbing past recorded levels in the first days after the field stopped, does not plateau. It keeps climbing as the ozone layer continues to thin. By the end of the first month, midday sun in equatorial regions and mid-latitudes represents a genuine medical emergency for unprotected skin, not a minor risk. Not something you manage with a high SPF sunscreen and a hat. A direct threat to the integrity of the tissue exposed to it. producing burns within minutes that would previously have required hours of the most intense summer sun. The calculation people have always made unconsciously, the one that says going outside is the default and staying inside is the exception, has to be reversed. Outside is now the exception. Outside requires preparation and protection, and a clear accounting of how much time you intend to spend there, and what you will be covered by for all of it. The eyes are among the first organs to show serious consequences. The human eye was not designed for this level of UV exposure. The lens, which focuses light onto the retina, absorbs ultraviolet radiation, and in doing so it changes. The proteins in the lens, exposed to UV at levels far beyond what the eye evolved to handle, begin to break down in the specific way that produces cataracts. Normally, cataracts are a condition of aging, a slow accumulation of damage over decades. In the weeks and months after the field stops, the accumulation is not slow. Animals that spend time outdoors begin to show signs of UV-related eye damage. People who work outside without adequate eye protection begin to notice changes in the clarity of their vision, a milkiness, a softening of edges, a loss of the sharpness that they have always taken as the baseline. This is not gradual in the way that the natural process of aging is gradual. It is a compression of decades of UV damage into months. The skin is telling a similar story. The cells that are most sensitive to ultraviolet radiation, the ones whose DNA is most vulnerable to the specific kind of damage that UV light causes, are accumulating mutations at rates that would normally take years or decades of intense sun exposure. The repair mechanisms that cells use to fix UV-induced DNA damage are still working, still doing what they always do, but they were built to keep up with a certain rate of damage. That rate has increased beyond what the repair systems can manage. The damage is accumulating faster than it can be corrected. And accumulated, uncorrected UV damage in skin cells is the mechanism by which skin cancer develops. The cancer that results is not appearing overnight. The biology does not work that way. But the foundation for it is being laid in millions of people who are going outside without adequate protection, who are underestimating a risk that looks like sunburn, but is something considerably more serious. The people who understand this first are the dermatologists and the oncologists and the public health researchers who have spent their careers studying the relationship between UV exposure and biological damage. They begin issuing guidance very early in the crisis, guidance that is urgent and specific and backed by data that the instruments are producing in real time. Stay out of direct sunlight between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Cover all exposed skin. Use eye protection rated for UV at levels far higher than any sunglasses currently available were designed to handle. The guidance is correct, and it is delivered with appropriate urgency, and it is received by a population that is simultaneously dealing with a power grid that is failing, a food supply that is becoming unreliable, a communication system that is degrading, and a sky that has been doing inexplicable things for weeks. The guidance about UV exposure competes for attention with every other urgent thing. And urgent things that compete for attention are the things that are most likely to be partially followed, selectively applied, taken less seriously than they deserve. There is also the question of what adequate protection actually means in a world where the supply chains that would deliver it are compromised. The sunscreen on the shelves of pharmacies was manufactured before the field stopped. It will run out. The protective clothing that blocks UV radiation, the kind with specific ratings and specific weaves designed for specific levels of protection, was produced by factories that are now running on limited or no power. The replacement supply of these things, which in a functioning world would be a logistics problem with a solution, is in a world where the grid is down and the transportation networks are disrupted, a problem without an obvious answer. People begin to improvise. They wear more clothing. They stay in the shade. They rearrange their days around the movement of the sun, going out in the early morning and the late evening and spending the middle hours of the day under cover. This improvisation is effective to a degree. It is also a reorganization of how human life works that is so fundamental, so contrary to the patterns that modern civilization developed over centuries, that it is not a small adjustment. It is a different way of being in the world. There is something ancient in it. The adjustment that people are making in response to a sun that has become dangerous, the covering of skin, the timing of activity around the hours of peak intensity, the retreat to shade and shelter during the most dangerous parts of the day, is not without precedent in human history. In the regions of the world that have always had intense sun, in the deserts and the high-altitude plateaus where UV has always been more intense than in temperate zones, human cultures developed exactly these adaptations over thousands of years. The clothing, the architecture, the daily rhythms of people who live in very hot and very bright places were designed, slowly and through long experience, to manage a relationship with the sun that required management. What those cultures worked out over millennia, the people of every climate and latitude are now working out in weeks, without the benefit of generations of accumulated wisdom, under the pressure of a crisis that is also producing every other kind of difficulty at the same time. The plants are working out their own version of the same problem. The crops in the fields are not able to cover themselves, or retreat to shade or change their daily rhythms. They are in the ground, facing the sky, receiving whatever the sky is sending down, with no ability to choose differently. The UV damage to plant tissue is real and measurable, and it compounds over time. Leaves that should be spending their days converting sunlight into energy are instead spending part of that energy repairing UV damage. Resources that were supposed to go into growth and yield and reproduction are being diverted into cellular repair. Crop yields in regions with high UV exposure begin to decline. Not to nothing, not immediately, but measurably, consistently, and in a direction that does not change. The food system was already under pressure from the power grid failures and the disruption of the supply chain and the loss of the pollinator navigation that bees and other insects relied on. Now it is also under pressure from a sky that is producing too much of the wrong kind of light. The farm is not failing. The food is not gone. But the margins are shrinking in every direction at once, and shrinking margins in a food system mean that the number of people the system can feed is decreasing even as the number of people who need to be fed remains the same. The slow burn is the most difficult part of this story to hold in the mind because it does not have a single moment. It does not have a day on which you can say this is when it became serious. It has a direction, and the direction is consistently away from the conditions that made the surface habitable in the form that civilization depends on. And it is moving in that direction every day, in every region, for every living thing that spends time under open sky. The fast disasters, the grid failure, the satellite loss, the navigational chaos of the animal world, those had beginnings. Those produced visible, dramatic events that people could point to and say this happened on this day and the world changed. The slow burn does not work that way. It works the way water works when it is finding a crack in stone. Not dramatically, not with any single moment of rupture, but with the patient, relentless pressure of something that has time on its side and is not in any hurry because it does not need to be. Outside, the sky is still blue. The sun is still rising and setting in the same places it always has. The air still smells like air and the world still looks, in most of its visible surfaces, like the world you know. But the invisible damage is accumulating. In the cells of your skin and the proteins of your lens and the leaves of the plants in the fields and the bodies of the animals in the open. All of it accumulating quietly in a direction that does not reverse on its own, toward consequences that take time to arrive, but that, once they arrive, cannot simply be undone by good intentions or emergency protocols or any of the tools that work on the fast dangers. The slow burn is not looking for your attention. It does not need it. It will keep burning whether you are paying attention or not. And while it burns, quietly and patiently, on the surface of a world that still looks mostly like itself, the people who understand what is happening are already moving in a direction that their ancestors would recognize immediately. Down, away from the sky, into the only material thick enough to do what the field used to do, to stand between the living and the thing in the sky that wants, without malice, without awareness, without any intention at all, to come all the way through. There is something very old in the decision to go underground, older than civilization, older than agriculture, older than the first city or the first building or the first deliberate act of construction. Before any of those things existed, before the species that would eventually build cities had developed the language to describe what it was doing or why, it was already going underground, into caves, into rock shelters, into any natural hollow in the earth that put stone between a body and the sky. The instinct preceded the understanding. Long before anyone could articulate why the cave was safer, the cave was being used. The body knew what the mind had not yet found words for. That solid rock is protection. That the sky, for all its beauty, is not always on your side. That sometimes the wisest thing a living creature can do is put the earth itself between itself and whatever is coming from above. In the weeks after the field stops, that instinct wakes up again, not as a memory, not as a conscious reference to anything that happened before, just as a response to a situation that the deep biology of the species recognizes, even if the conscious mind is still working out the details. People begin moving toward shelter, not the shelter of buildings, which are still standing and still offering shade and still blocking wind, but are no longer offering power or running water or the infrastructure that made them functional in the modern sense. Something more substantial than that. Something with mass, basements, parking structures, subway tunnels, the underground spaces that cities have always had but have always treated as utilitarian, as the unglamorous infrastructure beneath the interesting parts, begin to be recognized as something else, as the most valuable real estate in a city that is rapidly rethinking what value means. The subway systems of the world's great cities were not built to be homes. They were built to move people from one surface location to another as efficiently as possible, spending as little time underground as the engineering required. The tunnels are narrow and the platforms are functional, and the lighting was always supplied by the grid that is now failing. But the tunnels are deep. The concrete and the earth above them is thick, and thick concrete and thick earth block ultraviolet radiation with a completeness that no amount of sunscreen and protective clothing on the surface can match. The people who understand what the UV levels are doing, who have access to the data, or who have simply burned badly enough in their own experience to understand the trend, begin to identify the underground spaces not as refuges from inconvenience, but as the safest places available. This migration does not happen all at once. It does not happen in an organized way with a central authority directing it and resources prepositioned to support it. It happens the way human adaptations to sudden changed conditions always happen, gradually and then quickly, individually and then collectively, with the people who figure it out first showing the people around them what they have figured out, and the idea spreading not through any formal channel, but through the oldest and most reliable human communication system. One person telling another what they have seen and what they have done about it. The underground spaces begin to fill, not just with people seeking temporary shelter, but with the beginnings of something more sustained. Because the people who move underground do not move alone. They bring what they can carry. They bring food and water and tools and the specific knowledge that their particular lives have given them. A doctor brings medicine and the understanding of how to use it. A farmer brings seeds and the understanding of soil and growth cycles. An electrician brings wire and the understanding of how to route power from whatever sources can still be found. An engineer brings the ability to look at a space that was built for one purpose and redesign it in their mind for a different one. The underground fills not just with bodies, but with the accumulated practical knowledge of a civilization that built itself on the surface and is now, with extraordinary urgency, trying to move the most essential parts of itself below. The cities above are not abandoned, not quickly, not completely, not by everyone. There are people who stay on the surface, who have reasons or circumstances that keep them there. The elderly who cannot easily be moved. The people who believe, with a certainty born of not having experienced the worst of the UV exposure yet, that the situation will resolve, that the field will come back, that this is a crisis with an end they can wait out in the homes they have always lived in. The people who simply have nowhere to go below. The surface does not empty, but it changes. The rhythm of it changes. The relationship between the surface city and the sun changes in a way that anyone watching from above, from any height that offered a view of the streets, would recognize immediately. The streets are busy in the early morning. In the hour after dawn, before the sun climbs to the angle where its UV intensity becomes dangerous even in the weakened state of the ozone layer, the surface is alive. People move with purpose and speed. They accomplish in 2 hours what the old world would have spread across an entire day. They gather water from the sources that still have it. They find and transport food. They communicate through notes and through shouting across the distance and through the low-tech network of people moving between locations with information held in their heads rather than their devices. And then, as the sun climbs toward midday, the streets go quiet. Not gradually. Quickly, the way a crowd moves out of a stadium, purposefully and all at once, because everyone understands the same thing at the same moment. The sun is at the angle now. It is time to be somewhere else. The middle of the day belongs to the underground, to the tunnels and the basements and the parking structures and the natural caves where they exist near urban areas. The sounds of the city during these hours are different from any sounds the city has made before. Muffled, underground. The sound of a population that has compressed itself below the surface and is managing the compressed space with varying degrees of success. Children who have grown up in wide open apartments with views of the sky are in tunnels. Adults who define their daily lives by morning commutes and afternoon meetings are renegotiating what a day means and what it is for and how to spend it in a space that was built for passing through rather than living in. The evening brings the second period of surface activity. After the sun has descended enough that the UV index has dropped to something manageable, the streets fill again. This is the longer period, stretching from late afternoon through the night, lit now not by the artificial lights of the grid, but by whatever sources of light the underground communities have managed to rig together, and by the aurora, which is still there, still filling the sky with color, still beautiful in the way that things can be beautiful when you know what they cost. The night city is quieter than the old city used to be at night, darker, but not empty. People are on the surface in the evenings because the surface at night is safe in a way that midday is not. The rhythm has reversed. The middle of the day is rest and shelter. The ends of the day are activity and community. This reversal is not comfortable. It is not presented here as an adaptation that solves the problem, because it does not solve the problem. The problem is that the surface of the planet has become significantly less hospitable than it was, and a reorganization of daily timing around UV peaks does not change the underlying condition. It manages it. It reduces the damage being accumulated by the bodies of the people making the adjustment. But managing a condition and solving it are different things, and the people living this new rhythm know the difference even if they do not say it in those words. They know that what they are doing is buying time. What they are less certain about is what the time is being bought for. The architecture of the underground begins to change, not through any grand design, but through the accumulated decisions of people solving immediate problems. Where is the water coming from? Where does waste go? How is air circulated in a space that was not designed for continuous habitation? How is food grown when growing requires light, and light is the thing you are hiding from? The answers to these questions, worked out by hand and by trial, and by the particular genius of necessity, begin to transform the underground from a temporary refuge into something more like a place. Not a comfortable place, not a place anyone would have chosen, but a place with a logic, with systems, with the particular kind of social organization that emerges whenever a group of people has to solve the same set of problems together for an extended period of time. Some of the solutions are extraordinary in their simplicity. Mirrors and reflective surfaces used to bring filtered light from above into spaces below. Light that has passed through enough material to have its UV component significantly reduced. Fiber optic cables, repurposed from their original function of carrying data to carry actual light, threaded through the earth from surface collection points to underground growing spaces where plants can photosynthesize without their tenders being exposed to the sky that the light is coming from. Hydroponic systems built from components salvaged from hardware stores and restaurants, growing food in containers using water and nutrient solution and the carefully managed filtered light that the mirrors and the cables are delivering. The city is not growing enough food this way, not nearly enough, but it is growing some. And some, in a situation where all the alternatives are worse, is a foundation. The social life of the underground is a subject of its own complexity. The people who are sharing these spaces did not choose each other. They were sorted by geography, by who happened to be near an entrance to a tunnel or a basement when the decision was made to go below. They have different languages, different customs, different assumptions about authority and fairness, and the right way to organize a shared resource. These differences do not dissolve because the circumstances are difficult. If anything, difficulty makes them sharper, because scarcity makes disagreements about distribution more consequential, and the closeness of the underground makes the friction of different ways of being more constant. What emerges in these spaces is not harmony, it is negotiation. A continuous, exhausting, occasionally productive negotiation about how to share a small amount of what is needed among a large number of people who need it. But something else also emerges. something that is harder to quantify and easier to dismiss, but that anyone who has lived through a sustained collective difficulty and come out the other side will recognize. A form of knowledge about other people that only comes from being in close and sustained proximity with them under pressure. A kind of understanding of who someone is, what they are capable of, what they are afraid of, what they will do when the options are very few, that no ordinary social context provides. The people of the underground know each other in ways that the people of the old surface city almost never did. This is not a comfort. It is not a silver lining offered to soften what is otherwise a story of enormous loss. It is simply a fact about what happens when human beings are compressed together by circumstances beyond their control. They learn each other. They adapt to each other. And in that adaptation, something that might survive the crisis begins to take shape. On the surface above them, the city still stands. The buildings are still there, most of them, their glass and steel catching the light of the aurora at night in ways that their architects never imagined and their owners never anticipated. The streets are empty in the middle of the day and busy at the edges. The sun moves across the sky in the same arc it always has, indifferent to what is happening beneath it, delivering exactly what it has always delivered, only now with less between it and the surface than there used to be. The city that was built for the old world is still here. It is just being used differently. And below it, in the tunnels and the basements and the converted parking structures, the people who built that city are working out what comes next. Not the restoration of what was. Not the return to the morning with the coffee and the pale gold light, and the assumption that everything will keep working the way it always has. Something different. Something that starts underground and does not yet know what it will look like when, if, it comes back to the light. But the underground is not only a physical space, it is also a biological one. Because the field that is gone did not only protect the cities and the grid and the navigation systems of the animals. It also protected something inside every human body, something quiet and chemical and deeply connected to the way a person feels, the way they sleep, the way they hold their sense of the world together from one day to the next. And in the tunnels and the basements and the compressed underground spaces of the new city, that internal system is also under pressure. Not from UV radiation, not from the failing grid, from the absence of the field itself. And what happens to a human body when the field it evolved inside of disappears is the quietest, and in some ways the most personal part of everything we have been following tonight. You were built inside a field, not metaphorically, not in the loose sense of being shaped by an environment or influenced by the conditions around you. Literally built inside a field. Every cell that divided to form you, every protein that folded into the shape it needed to be, every nerve connection that formed, and every hormone that found its rhythm, did so inside the specific magnetic environment of the Earth. Your body did not develop in a neutral space. It developed inside something. And that something, over the 4 billion years that life has been developing on this planet, became part of the reference system that biology uses to regulate itself. Not the only reference, not even the most obvious one, but a real one woven into the timing and the chemistry of living systems in ways that we are only beginning to map, and that, until the field was gone, we had almost no reason to look for. The pineal gland sits at the center of your brain. It is small, about the size of a grain of rice, and for most of medical history it was something of a mystery. It produces melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep, and its production is tied to light, specifically to the absence of light, which is why melatonin rises in the evening and falls in the morning, and why darkness is genuinely necessary for the kind of sleep that restores rather than merely passes time. This much has been understood for decades. What has been understood more recently is that the pineal gland is also sensitive to magnetic fields. Inside human brain tissue, including in the regions around the pineal gland, researchers have found tiny crystals of magnetite, the same mineral that gives certain bacteria and certain migratory animals their magnetic sensitivity. These crystals are real. They are in your head right now. And while their function in human biology is not fully understood, their presence suggests that the human body has at least some capacity to register the magnetic environment it is living in. Under normal conditions, this registration is invisible to conscious experience. You do not feel the field. You do not sense it the way you sense light or sound or temperature. But your biology may be using it in ways that operate below the threshold of awareness, in the regulation of hormonal cycles, in the timing of sleep, in the maintenance of the particular chemical balance that produces the feeling of being, on an ordinary day, more or less all right. The field is part of the background that the body calibrated itself to over evolutionary time. And when the background changes, the calibration can drift. In the underground spaces of the failing cities, the people who have retreated below the surface are cut off from ultraviolet radiation, which is the goal, the reason they went below. But they are not cut off from the collapse of the field. The field passes through rock and concrete and earth as easily as it passes through air. There is no shielding from it underground. If anything, the underground removes some of the other environmental signals that normally help the body orient itself in time, in particular the natural variation of light over the course of a day, which is one of the primary cues that the circadian system uses to maintain its rhythm. In the tunnels, it is always the same dim light or the same darkness. The body's clock, which was already being disrupted by the chaos of the field, loses another of its anchors. The sleep problems begin early. Not for everyone at the same time, not with the same intensity, but consistently across the population of the underground, the quality of sleep begins to deteriorate. People who have always slept well find themselves lying awake in the dark for hours before sleep comes. People who have always woken once or twice in the night find themselves waking 4 or 5 times, unable to return to sleep easily, lying in the particular wakefulness of 3 in the morning that feels different from the wakefulness of any other hour, heavier and more absolute and more resistant to the ordinary reassurances. The children, whose sleep needs are greater and whose regulatory systems are still developing, are especially affected. The underground communities begin to notice within the first few weeks that something is wrong with everyone's sleep and that the wrongness is getting worse rather than stabilizing. This is not simply a consequence of stress, though stress is present in quantities that would disrupt sleep under any circumstances. It is not simply a consequence of the disruption of normal routines, though that disruption is total and its effects on sleep are real. Those factors are there and they matter. But underneath them, in the chemistry, something more fundamental is shifting. Melatonin production, which depends on the precise timing of darkness and light signals, and on the underlying regulatory rhythm that the body maintains independently of any single environmental cue, is becoming irregular. The hormone that is supposed to rise predictably in the evening, carry sleep through the night, and fall predictably in the morning to allow waking, is no longer following that arc with any consistency. It rises at wrong times and falls at wrong times, and the subjective experience of this chemical irregularity is an inability to sleep when sleep is needed, and an inability to feel fully awake when wakefulness is required. and a general erosion of the boundary between the two states that the body has always maintained automatically, without effort, without any conscious management at all. The mood follows the sleep. This is not a mysterious connection. The relationship between sleep quality and emotional regulation is one of the most robust findings in the biology of human behavior. A single night of poor sleep measurably reduces the capacity for emotional resilience, for patience, for the kind of perspective that allows difficult circumstances to feel manageable rather than overwhelming. A week of poor sleep begins to produce symptoms that are clinically indistinguishable from depression in some of their features. A month of consistently disrupted sleep in a population that is simultaneously dealing with fear and loss and uncertainty and physical hardship produces a collective emotional state that has no single name, but that anyone who has experienced it will recognize. A kind of flatness, a difficulty feeling the future as real or reachable, a heaviness that is not grief exactly and not despair exactly, but that resembles both and resists the usual remedies for either. The underground communities are not broken by this. People are more resilient than the worst moments suggest, and the evidence of that resilience is everywhere in the tunnels and the basements where people are solving problems and caring for each other, and finding ways to make the compressed spaces function. But the weight of disrupted sleep and disrupted chemistry is real, and it is present in every interaction, in every negotiation about resources, in every decision about what to do next. The people managing these communities are making consequential decisions while running on biology that is not operating at its baseline. The decisions they make are not irrational, but they are made under a kind of cognitive and emotional load that would not have been there in a world where the field was intact and the sleep was what it used to be. The body is also registering the loss of the field in other systems. The research that connected geomagnetic activity to cardiovascular function, the studies that showed correlations between solar storms and increased rates of heart problems, pointed toward a mechanism involving the autonomic nervous system, the part of the nervous system that regulates heart rate and blood pressure, and the basic rhythms of circulation, without any conscious input. This system is sensitive to the electromagnetic environment in ways that are not fully understood, but that have been measured often enough to be taken seriously. In the weeks and months after the field collapses entirely, the autonomic systems of the people living through it are under a kind of pressure that has no precedent in recorded medicine. Not an acute pressure that produces dramatic events. A chronic, low-level, constant pressure that expresses itself in elevated resting heart rates, in blood pressure readings that are slightly higher than they should be, in a kind of physiological tension that the body is maintaining without being asked to and cannot easily release. This is what it feels like from the inside to be a body in a world without its field. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a persistent sense of something being slightly wrong that cannot be named or located or fixed by anything immediately available. A tiredness that sleep does not fully address. A wakefulness that feels more like vigilance than alertness. The body is not broken. It is adapted or trying to adapt to conditions it was not built for. An adaptation, when it is happening in real time under pressure, does not feel like growth. It feels like effort. Constant, exhausting, invisible effort that runs underneath everything else and makes everything else slightly harder than it would otherwise be. There are people in the underground who are managing this better than others, not because they are stronger or better or more virtuous, but because of specific circumstances that are protecting their regulatory systems to a greater degree. The people who have managed to maintain something close to a normal light cycle in their underground spaces, using the filtered and redirected light from above to mark a genuine difference between day and night, are sleeping somewhat better than those in constant dimness. The people who have access to enough food to maintain stable blood sugar are regulating their moods somewhat better than those who are not. The people who are doing physical work during the appropriate hours of their new rhythm are finding sleep somewhat easier than those who are sedentary. The biology responds to the conditions it has, and better conditions produce measurably better outcomes even when none of the conditions are good. But the deepest disruption is the one that has no behavioral remedy. The field is gone. The magnetite in the pineal gland has nothing to orient to. The ancient regulatory signal that the body has been receiving since before the species existed, the constant low-level magnetic reference that was always in the background of every biological process, the thing that was so reliable that evolution never needed to develop a conscious awareness of it, is absent. And the absence is felt not as a sensation but as a kind of biological uncertainty, a subtle but pervasive loosening of the internal coherence that the body maintains automatically when everything is working as it should. It is the feeling, if it can be called a feeling, of a system running without one of its reference signals, still running, still capable of most of what it was always capable of, but looser, less precisely calibrated, more subject to drift. The people in the tunnels do not know how to name this. They know they are not sleeping well. They know they are more anxious than their circumstances alone account for. They know that the heaviness in their chests is not entirely explained by the grief of what they have lost, though the grief is real and enormous and deserves its own accounting. Something else is also happening. Something internal and biological and not visible to anyone around them. They are carrying the absence of the field in their bodies the way you carry a low-grade fever, not acutely ill, not incapacitated, but not quite right, and not able to identify precisely what not quite right means or what would make it better. Sleep, when it comes, is a mercy. In sleep, the body turns toward its own processes, away from the weight of the conscious assessment of the situation, away from the calculations about food and water and safety and the future. In sleep, the brain does the quiet maintenance work that wakefulness does not allow, the consolidation of memory, the regulation of hormone cycles, the repair of the cellular damage that the day accumulates. Sleep is where the body tries to restore what the world is taking away. And in the underground, in the compressed spaces where the field is absent and the light is always wrong and the stress is always present, sleep is harder to reach than it has ever been. But it is still there, still available, still offering, when it comes, the particular mercy of a few hours inside your own biology, away from the enormous broken world outside it. Let that be enough for now. The body is still here, still working, still reaching in the hours of darkness for the rest it needs. The field may be gone, but the need for sleep is older than the field, older than the species, older than almost anything we carry. And in the tunnels and the basements and the deep places where the people of the underground have made their temporary homes, the sleep that comes is real sleep, imperfect and insufficient and harder won than it used to be, but real. And real sleep is where the next part of the story begins. Not the part about what has been lost, the part about what remains. And what remains, it turns out, is more than anyone in the first terrible weeks of the collapse was able to believe. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from losing something you never knew you loved. Not the sharp grief of losing a person or a place you were conscious of valuing. something quieter than that and in some ways harder to locate. The grief of discovering in the moment of loss that something you never once thought about was load-bearing, that the invisible thing you never considered was the thing holding up everything you did consider, that the background you never noticed was the reason the foreground was possible at all. This is the grief that runs underneath all the other griefs in the months after the field stops, not for the field itself, which most people still cannot fully conceptualize or emotionally connect to, but for everything the field was quietly supporting, for the world it was making possible without anyone asking it to, for the morning with the coffee and the pale gold light and the phone lighting up with messages from people you care about. That morning is gone, and the grief of it is strange and diffuse and hard to place because you did not know when you were living it that it was something that needed protecting. The machines that modern civilization trusted are silent now. Not all of them. Not everywhere simultaneously. But the silence is spreading, and the silence is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of systems that were built to run continuously and have stopped. The data centers that held the collective memory of the digital world, the photographs and the records and the communications and the financial information and the medical histories and the accumulated documentation of billions of individual lives, those centers ran on power. The power is gone in most places. And without power, the servers that store the data cannot maintain the temperature they need to operate. They overheat. They shut down. The data does not disappear instantly. It is still on the drives, encoded in the arrangement of magnetic particles on spinning disks or in the charged states of flash memory cells. But it is inaccessible, locked inside machines that cannot run without the electricity that is no longer there. This is the detail that is hardest to absorb in the early weeks. Not the darkness, which is physically real and immediately felt. Not the hunger which follows the darkness as food distribution systems collapse. Not even the UV radiation, which is dangerous but manageable for people who understand what they are dealing with. The hardest thing to absorb is the inaccessibility of everything that was stored in the machines. The world built an enormous amount of itself in digital form over the past several decades. Records of property ownership, medical histories, educational credentials, financial accounts, legal documents, the entire infrastructure of institutional trust, the system by which a society knows who owns what and who has agreed to what and who is responsible for what, was encoded in digital systems that required continuous power to remain accessible. When the power went, the institutional memory went with it. Not permanently, not irretrievably, but practically. In the immediate term, for the people trying to manage the consequences of the collapse, the records are as gone as if they had never existed. This produces a particular kind of social problem that is different from the physical problems of shelter and food and safety, though it compounds all of them. In a world where records are inaccessible, the proof of things becomes a matter of assertion and witness rather than documentation. Who owns this building? Who has the right to this supply of medicine? Who made this agreement with whom? These questions, which in the old world had answers that could be retrieved from a database, now have only the answers that people can remember and that other people can confirm. Memory and community become the infrastructure of trust in the absence of the machines that used to hold that trust in digital form. This is not a comfortable transition. Memory is imperfect. Communities disagree, and the absence of a neutral record that everyone can check creates conditions where disputes that would previously have been resolved by looking something up instead have to be resolved by negotiation or by power, or by the particular social dynamics of whoever is present and whoever is not. The financial system is a version of this problem at a scale that affects everyone simultaneously. Money, in the modern world, is almost entirely a record in a database. The physical currency that exists represents a tiny fraction of the value that was stored in digital accounts. When the databases become inaccessible, the money does not vanish in a physical sense. The value that was there yesterday is not destroyed, but it is unreachable. A person with substantial savings in a bank account that is now inaccessible has no more immediate purchasing power than a person with nothing. The stores that have food in the early days before the supply chain fully collapses cannot process digital payments. The cash that people have on hand is quickly spent, and after the cash is gone, the economy that was built on the assumption of digital transaction does not gracefully revert to an earlier model. It does not revert to anything organized. It splinters into 1,000 local arrangements, each one improvised, each one reflecting the specific resources and relationships and power dynamics of the specific community where it exists. Barter is too simple a word for what actually happens. Barter implies an equivalence, an agreed exchange of one thing of value for another thing of value, negotiated between parties who have roughly similar information about what things are worth. What happens in the weeks after the financial system becomes inaccessible is messier than barter. It is the rapid discovery, by every person and every community, of what actually matters in a world where the grid is down, and the supply chain is broken, and the UV radiation is climbing, and the food is running short. What matters is not what mattered before. It is not a salary or a square footage or the particular credentials encoded in the inaccessible database. What matters is food and water, and the ability to purify water, and the knowledge of how to grow food, and the physical capacity to do the work that survival requires, and the social skills to build the relationships that make collective survival possible. The currency of the new world is not money. It is competence and trust, and the willingness to show up and do what needs to be done. This shift is not simply economic. It is a complete reorganization of which human qualities the world rewards. The qualities that were most rewarded in the old world, the ability to navigate complex institutional systems, to manage information, to operate effectively in the abstract economy of digital value, are suddenly much less useful than the qualities that the old world often undervalued. The ability to fix things with your hands, the knowledge of how plants grow and when they need water and what they look like when they are sick. The understanding of how water moves through soil and how to find it and how to make it safe to drink. The capacity to read weather and terrain and the behavior of animals, the knowledge of which plants in a given region are edible and which are not. These things, which the old world categorized as vocational or artisanal or rural, skills that were respected but not particularly glamorous, become in the new world the most valuable knowledge that exists. The machines that held the old world together are not coming back on their own. The satellites that provided navigation and communication and timing are failing in orbit, and without the ability to launch replacements, the failures are permanent for the foreseeable future. The power grid will not be restored at anything like its previous scale without the transformers that cannot be manufactured quickly enough to matter in the near term. The internet, the vast distributed network of cables and repeaters and servers and switches that connected the digital world together, is broken at too many points and in too many places to be repaired under current conditions. The machines we trusted are not going to rescue us. The rescue, if it comes, is going to come from a direction that the machines were never designed to provide. It is going to come from people. From the particular and irreplaceable capacity of human beings to look at a situation that is worse than anything they planned for and find within it the things that still work. To take the pieces of what was and build something new from them that is adequate to what is. This capacity is not romantic. It is not a silver lining that compensates for everything that has been lost. The loss is real and enormous, and the accounting of it, when it is eventually possible to make that accounting, will be staggering. But alongside the loss, running in parallel with it, often in the same people on the same day, is the other thing. The thing that has gotten the species through every previous version of conditions being worse than they were before. The ability to adapt, not to wish things were different, not to wait for the machines to come back, but to look at what is actually here, in this tunnel, in this basement, in this field, in this community of people who did not choose each other but are here together, and ask what can be done with this. The knowledge that was in the machines is not entirely gone. Much of it was in the machines because it came from people first. People wrote the code and designed the systems and made the records and built the infrastructure. People who are still here, still alive, still carrying in their own memories and their own training and their own accumulated experience the knowledge that the machines were holding in digital form. A doctor who can no longer access electronic medical records still knows medicine. An engineer who can no longer access design software still understands structural principles. A farmer who can no longer look up crop rotation schedules still knows how farming works in the specific place where they farm. The machines were storage. The knowledge was always in the people, and the people are still here. This is the thing that the collapse of the machines reveals unexpectedly in the middle of everything else it reveals. That the civilization which built all those machines was not itself a machine. It was the people who built the machines, and those people are still present, still capable, still in possession of most of what they knew before the machines went dark. The machines were tools. Extraordinary, powerful, world-changing tools, but tools nonetheless. And the hands that made them are still here, ready, however reluctantly, to make something else. In the tunnels and the basements of the underground cities, this is beginning to happen. Slowly, imperfectly, with enormous friction and difficulty and loss, but happening. The knowledge that was distributed across millions of people who never expected to need it in this form is being gathered and shared and applied. The doctor is treating patients without electronic records, working from memory, and from the physical examination that medicine practiced before it had databases. The engineer is designing water systems, using calculations done on paper and materials salvaged from the surface. The farmer is advising on the hydroponic experiments that the underground communities are running, applying knowledge of plant biology to a context that plant biology was never intended for. The machines are dark. The people are not. And above all of this, above the tunnels and the silent servers and the failing satellites and the aurora-lit sky, the field is still absent, still collapsed, still the underlying cause of everything that has followed from its loss. But the field, the one that stopped, is not the only field in this story. There is another one, older, not made of liquid iron or magnetic forces or the physics of charged particles. Made of the particular way human beings orient themselves toward each other when the other options have been removed. The field of trust and shared necessity, and the knowledge that the person next to you in the dark is dealing with the same darkness you are dealing with. This field did not require the Earth's magnetic field to exist. It has been there, in one form or another, for as long as the species has been gathering in groups and trying to survive things together. and it is still there, in the tunnels, in the basements, in the improvised communities of the underground, invisible like the other field, but real. And in the months ahead, it is going to matter more than any machine ever did. Time moves differently when the grid is down, not in the physical sense, not in the sense that the seconds are longer or the hours shorter, but in the sense that the markers we used to measure time by have gone quiet. The notification that arrived every few minutes. The schedule that structured the day into units with specific purposes and specific ends. The artificial light that overrode the natural rhythm of dark and dawn and imposed a different rhythm, one built for productivity and continuity and the particular needs of a civilization that never wanted to stop. All of that is gone, and in its absence, time does something it has not done for most people in the modern world. It expands, not comfortably. Not in the way that a slow afternoon in a garden expands, giving you room to breathe. It expands the way a space expands when you remove the furniture from it. You become very aware of the size of it. You become very aware of how much of it there is, and how slowly it moves when you are not filling it with the usual things. The people of the underground experience time differently than they did before. The days are organized around the movement of the sun, which they cannot directly see, but can track through the filtered light that comes down through the mirror systems and the fiber cables, through the reports of the people who go to the surface in the early morning and the late evening, through the quality of the aurora light that filters into the higher spaces near the tunnel entrances after dark. The rhythm of the day is simpler than it used to be, more tied to biology and less tied to the arbitrary structures that the old world imposed. This simplicity is not experienced as freedom. It is experienced as loss, the loss of the complexity that felt like richness when it was present and feels like impoverishment now that it is gone. But something is also happening in the silence that is not simply loss. In the absence of the constant incoming stream of information that the connected world provided, in the absence of the notifications and the updates and the continuous low-level noise of a civilization communicating with itself at enormous speed and volume, something older is becoming audible. The things that people say to each other when they are not saying the things that the machines used to say for them. The stories, the memories, the knowledge that was never encoded in any database because it lived in a person and was passed directly to another person and did not require a machine to travel. In the underground communities, people are talking more than they have in years. Not about the crisis, not primarily, though the crisis is always present and always part of the conversation. They are talking about what they know. A woman who spent 30 years as a nurse is describing, in detail, to anyone who will listen, how to identify the signs of infection in a wound without laboratory equipment. A man who grew up on a farm before moving to the city is explaining the principles of soil composition to a group of people who have never grown anything, but are now responsible for the hydroponic systems that are providing a portion of the community's food. An older person who was a child in a country that experienced a prolonged period of infrastructure failure is describing what worked and what did not, which improvisations held and which ones failed, what the community did that helped it survive, and what it wished it had done differently. This transmission of knowledge from person to person, in the old way that knowledge traveled before it was encoded in machines, is one of the most important things happening in the months after the collapse. Not because it replaces what the machines provided. It does not. The machines held vastly more information than any number of human conversations can transmit in any reasonable time frame. but it provides something the machines could not. It provides knowledge with a face attached to it. Knowledge that comes with the accountability of the person who holds it, with the ability to ask a question and receive an answer tailored to the specific situation, with the social weight of a relationship between the person who knows and the person who needs to know. This is how knowledge traveled for almost the entire history of the species. It is slower than a database. It is less complete. It is more subject to the particular biases and limitations of the person transmitting it. But it is alive in a way that stored data is not, and it is present in a way that an inaccessible server is not. The months pass. The field does not return quickly. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell because it has no single event, no turning point, no moment that can be pointed to as the beginning of the recovery. The recovery, if it is happening in the same way that the damage happened, quietly, gradually, in a direction that is only visible when you compare where you are now to where you were some time ago rather than to where you were before the collapse. The standard of comparison has shifted. The question is no longer how does this compare to the old world. That comparison is too painful and too large and too present in every moment to be useful as a measure of progress. The question has become how does this compare to last month? And measured against last month, some things are better. The hydroponic systems are producing more than they were. The knowledge that the farmer shared with the community has been applied and refined over months of trial, and the yields are improving. The water systems that the engineers designed from salvaged components are functioning more reliably than they were in the first weeks when they were improvised under pressure. The medical knowledge of the nurse and the others who brought specific expertise underground is being shared more systematically, written down in notebooks that are becoming the beginning of a new kind of record, handwritten, incomplete, imperfect, but present and accessible in a way that the digital records locked in the dark servers are not. The social negotiations that were so fractious and exhausting in the early weeks have settled into something that is still contentious but more predictable. The rules of the underground community are being worked out not by decree, but by the slow accumulation of agreed precedents, each one the result of a specific dispute that was eventually resolved and whose resolution was remembered and applied the next time a similar situation arose. This is civilization being rebuilt, not in the grand sense, not at the scale of the old world, not with any of the speed or complexity or reach that the connected, powered world was capable of, but in the essential sense. People organizing their shared life around shared problems, developing shared rules, transmitting shared knowledge, building the kind of trust that makes collective action possible. The underground communities are not utopias. They are full of the same conflicts and the same failures and the same human limitations that every community has always been full of. But they are communities. They are functioning. They are producing people who know how to do the things that the immediate situation requires, and who are teaching those things to the people around them, and to the children who are growing up in these spaces having known nothing else. The children are worth thinking about for a moment. The children who were young when the collapse happened, and who are now older, who have spent the formative years of their development in the underground, learning what this world requires rather than what the old world required. They do not mourn what they do not remember. They are not carrying the grief of the old world the way the adults around them are, the grief of the morning with the coffee and the pale gold light and the phone lighting up. They are carrying something different, the specific, practical, hard-won knowledge of how to live in the world that actually exists. They know how to read the filtered light to tell the time of day. They know which surface hours are safe and which are not. They know how the water system works and how to fix it when it does not. They know the plants in the hydroponic systems by name and by need. They know the stories that the adults tell in the evenings, the stories of the old world that are already beginning to take on the quality of mythology, of a time before that is remembered but not recoverable. Above the underground, the surface world is not static. The UV intensity, which peaked in the months following the collapse as the ozone layer reached its minimum, is beginning very slowly to recover. Ozone is not gone. It is still being produced by the same ultraviolet light that destroys it, through the same photochemical process that has been producing it for hundreds of millions of years. Without the constant bombardment of solar wind particles that the magnetic field was deflecting, ozone destruction was enormously accelerated in the first months of the collapse. But the production has continued. And as the rate of destruction slowly decreases, for reasons that are not yet fully understood but that may involve changes in the upper atmosphere's chemistry that are moving in a favorable direction, the net concentration of ozone begins, very slowly, to stabilize and then to edge upward. This recovery is measured in instruments by scientists who have maintained their observatories through the collapse, who have kept their instruments running on whatever power sources they could find, who have continued to gather data, because gathering data is what they do, and because the data matters enormously for the people who are deciding when it might be safe to spend more time on the surface. The numbers are still bad. They are better than they were at the worst point, but still far above anything that would have been considered acceptable before the collapse. But the direction has changed. And direction, when you have been watching a number move steadily in the wrong direction for months, matters more than absolute value. The direction has changed. The field itself is also moving, not back to where it was. Not yet, possibly not for a very long time, possibly not in the same configuration it had before. But the complete incoherence of the early months is giving way to something slightly more organized. The chaos in the outer core that produced the collapse is not resolved, but it is evolving. The currents of liquid iron are finding new patterns, not the old patterns that produced the strong dipole field of the world before, but patterns of some kind, producing a field that is weak and complex and organized around multiple centers rather than two clear poles. A field that is a fraction of what it was but is no longer nothing. The instruments that measure it are showing something where they were showing almost nothing before. For the people underground, this change in the instruments does not immediately translate into a change in their lives. The field that the instruments are detecting is too weak to restore the magnetosphere to any meaningful protective function. The Van Allen belts that used to trap the most dangerous radiation are not reforming. The solar wind is still reaching the atmosphere much more directly than it did before. The UV situation, though slightly improved, is not improved enough to allow a return to the surface patterns of the old world. But the direction of the field's evolution is being watched very carefully by the people whose job it is to watch it, and the direction is, very slowly, towards something rather than away from everything. The long silence is not yet over. It will not be over for a time that is difficult to estimate, but that the models suggest is measured in centuries rather than decades. The time required for the outer core to reorganize its currents into a configuration that produces a field strong enough to do the work the old field did. The people underground will not live to see that world. Their children will not live to see it. The generations that will emerge from the underground into a sky that is genuinely safe, that will know the surface the way the people before the collapse knew it, are many generations away. This is the hardest part of the story to sit with. Not the collapse itself, dramatic as it was. The long middle. The time between the old world and whatever the new world eventually becomes. The time that is being lived right now in the tunnels and the basements. The time that has no clear end and no certain destination, and that requires, every single day, the decision to keep going anyway. That decision is being made. In the underground communities, every morning that begins with the assessment of the filtered light, and the planning of the day's work, and the distribution of the food, and the teaching of the children, and the maintenance of the systems that keep the community functioning, that decision is being made. Not dramatically, not heroically in any cinematic sense, just practically and persistently, and without the option of not making it, which is how the most important decisions have always been made. The long silence is also, in its way, a kind of rest, not comfortable, not chosen, but a rest from the noise and the speed and the constant incoming demand of the old world. In the silence, things that the noise was covering become audible. The actual sound of other people breathing in the same space. The sound of water moving through the pipes of the system that someone built with their hands. The sound of a child asking a question and an adult answering it with something they actually know. The sound of a community, imperfect and struggling and real, doing the daily work of existing together. Above all of it, the aurora still lights the night. It is different now than it was in the first weeks. Less dramatic, less globally uniform, more organized around the weak and multiple magnetic centers that the recovering field is beginning to produce. But still there, still visible from the tunnel entrances in the evening hours when the surface is safe. Still the most extraordinary light show any human generation has ever had as its permanent night sky. The children who grew up underground think of it as simply how the sky looks at night. The adults who remember the dark, star-filled sky of the old world look at the aurora with a feeling that is not quite grief and not quite wonder and not quite gratitude, but something that contains all three. It is proof, this light in the sky. Proof that the field is still there in some form, still interacting with the solar wind, still producing something from the collision between the sun and the planet. Proof that the story is not over, that the machine in the core is still running, still finding its way, still working towards something, even if that something is a very long time away. The aurora is the field made visible, and as long as it is there, the field is there, changed, weakened, disorganized, but present, still trying. We began this journey on an ordinary morning. Coffee, pale gold light, a phone screen lighting up with the small digital noise of a world that was running. It has flipped polarity hundreds of times, passing through the very instability we were exploring tonight each time it did, and it has always rebuilt itself on the other side. The field is patient because it has to be, because what it is doing is a long, slow process that cannot be hurried and does not need to be. It just needs to keep going, and it has. Tonight, while you have been following this story, the field has been doing its work. The solar wind has been arriving at the boundary of the magnetosphere at several hundred kilometers per second, carrying the radiation and the charged particles that it always carries, pressing against the boundary the way it always presses. And the field has been deflecting it, not perfectly. Some particles always get through, funneled toward the poles where the field lines dive toward the surface, producing the aurora that people travel great distances to see, and that the people of the underground communities we followed tonight looked at every evening from their tunnel entrances. But mostly, almost entirely, The solar wind has been arriving and the field has been pushing back, and the result has been another ordinary day on the surface of a protected planet. Your day. This day. The one that is ending right now as you drift towards sleep. The morning we began with, the one with the coffee and the pale gold light, was not just a morning. It was the product of 4 billion years of geology and physics, and the patient, continuous work of a machine you have never seen and will never see, running in the dark at the center of the planet, doing something that the surface would not be livable without. Every morning like that one, every ordinary, unremarkable morning that you wake up in a world with breathable air and liquid water and a sun that is warming rather than destroying, is downstream of that machine, is a consequence of it, is made possible by it. And knowing that does not make the coffee taste different or the light look different or the phone feel different in your hand. But it might make the morning feel different, not more dramatic, more substantial, more like the gift it actually is. What we lose, we learn to value. That is one of the oldest and most reliable patterns in human experience, and it is one of the most unfortunate because it requires the loss before the valuing, and the loss is always real and always costly. But there is a version of this pattern that does not require the loss. That only requires the imagination of it, the ability to follow a story to its end and come back from the following with something changed in how you see the beginning. You imagined a world without the field tonight. You followed it through the darkness and the loss and the long, slow adjustment and the patient, persistent work of people trying to build something livable in conditions that were not livable in the old way. You came back from that imagining to a world where the field is still here, where the morning is still possible, where the coffee and the pale gold light and the phone in your hand are still waiting for you on the other side of sleep. Come back to your body for a moment. Not away from sleep, not pulling yourself back toward wakefulness, but just noticing where you are. The weight of the blanket, the particular quality of the darkness in the room, the sound of your own breathing, slow and even, doing what breathing does, moving air through you, taking what you need, releasing what you do not. Your heart, steady in your chest, sending blood through you in the rhythm it has maintained since before you were born, and that it will maintain without any help from you, all the way through your sleep tonight. Your body is doing its work. The field is doing its work. The liquid iron 3,000 kilometers below you is moving in its ancient circles, generating the field that passes through the planet and through the building and through the floor and through your body right now, as it always has, as it always will. You are inside the gift. You have always been inside it. Tonight you know it in a way that you did not know it this morning. And that knowing is not a burden. It is not a responsibility. It is not something you need to do anything with right now. It is simply information about where you are, about what is holding you here, about the extraordinary, unremarkable, invisible, ancient, patient, continuous gift of a planet that has a field and a star that the field manages and a surface between them where the temperature is right and the water is liquid and the air is breathable, and where you can lie down at the end of a day and close your eyes and sleep. The field is there. It will be there when you wake. It will be there for the morning with the coffee and the pale gold light and the phone in your hand. You were sitting in a kitchen or lying in a bed or standing at a window, and the morning was doing what mornings do, arriving without drama, offering itself without ceremony, asking nothing of you except that you receive it. That morning was not remarkable. That was the whole point of it. It was the kind of morning that happened so reliably, so consistently, so without any particular effort on your part that you had stopped noticing it was happening at all. The coffee was just coffee. The light was just light. The phone was just the phone. You know now what was holding that morning together. Not the walls of the building or the wires in the ceiling or the pipes under the floor, though all of those mattered. Something older than any of those. Something that had been in place since before the first organism drew the first breath in the first shallow ocean of the early Earth. A field. Invisible, intangible, passing through you right now as you lie here, moving through the walls and the floor and the ground beneath the building, and continuing down through kilometers of rock to the churning liquid iron that produces it. 3,000 kilometers below where your body is resting. It was there this morning when you woke. It will be there tomorrow morning when you wake again. And it is there right now, in this moment, doing what it has always done, standing between you and the thing in the sky that would, without it, be something very different from what you experience it as. The sun is not your enemy. That is not the lesson here. The sun is the reason life exists on this planet. Its light drives every photosynthesizing organism that forms the base of every food chain that has ever existed. Its warmth maintains the temperature range that liquid water requires. Its gravity holds the solar system in the configuration that makes a stable orbit possible. The sun is not an adversary. It is the source. But the source is also, at full strength and full exposure, more than the surface of this planet can handle. And the thing that manages that relationship, that takes the full power of the star and filters it and deflects it and reduces it to something that living things can work with, is the field. The sun is not different because the field exists. But our relationship to it is. And that relationship, so ordinary, so taken for granted, so completely unexamined in the course of any normal day, is one of the great gifts in the history of this planet. A gift given by physics and maintained by geology and received, without acknowledgement, by every living thing that has ever existed here. We followed the loss of that gift through its consequences, and the consequences were enormous. The grid went dark and the satellites failed and the animals lost their maps, and the sky became a source of slow damage, and the cities reorganized themselves underground, and the machines that held the memory of civilization went silent, and the people who built those machines had to find, inside themselves and inside each other, the things that the machines could not provide. None of that was small. None of it was easy to sit with. But we followed it all the way through, not to frighten, not to overwhelm, but to understand. Because understanding where you are requires understanding what is holding you there. And what is holding you here, tonight, in this moment, is something worth understanding. The field is a kind of patience. Not a human patience, not a conscious patience, but the patience of a process that has been running for 4 billion years without stopping. The liquid iron in the outer core has been moving in the same general direction for longer than complex life has existed on this planet. The field it produces has wandered and weakened and flipped and recovered and wandered again. And through all of that wandering, it has never entirely stopped. It has never gone to zero and stayed there. It has always, eventually, found its way back to something. Not the same configuration it had before. Not necessarily stronger or more organized than before. But present, continuing, still generating the influence that reaches up through the planet and out into space and holds the boundary between here and the void. There is something in that continuity that is worth carrying with you into sleep. Not as a comfort in the sentimental sense, not as a reassurance that nothing bad can happen, because we have just spent considerable time exploring a scenario in which something very bad can happen, but as a different kind of reassurance. The reassurance of knowing that the system you are part of is ancient and has been tested and has survived everything it has encountered so far. The magnetic field of the Earth has been through more than we can imagine. It has been compressed by solar storms of a scale that makes the largest events in recorded history look minor. It has been confused and disrupted by the chaos in the core and has found its way back. It will be there for all the ordinary mornings that come after this one, all the mornings that you will not notice because you will not need to, because they will arrive the way they always arrive, without drama, without ceremony, offering themselves without asking anything of you except that you receive them. Receive them. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is, in fact, everything. The field is running. The morning is coming. Let sleep take you toward it. There is nothing you need to do. There is nothing you need to hold. The invisible architect is still working, 3,000 kilometers below where your body is resting. And the work it is doing tonight is the same work it has always done, patient and continuous and ancient and quiet and completely, entirely on your side. Sleep now. The shield is there. It has always been there.